Okay, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, so as Dave said, my name is Andrew Schleicher. Before I get really into my presentation, I want to ask you a couple of questions just to get you thinking about what Jefferson Barracks means to you. And if you want to share your responses to them, I'll ask for a few volunteers if you want to. So, first question, what are some people, memories, or ideas that you associate with Jefferson Barracks? I'm just going to give you a moment to think about that.
Military.
Okay, military. You, ma'am? Some places or people or ideas that you associate with Jefferson Barracks.
My mom
Okay.
took us there all the time.
And you, sir, in the white shirt? Anything? Okay. Well,
The
cemetery. Anybody else? Yeah.
Grant.
Okay, Mrs. S. Grant.
At one point, my grandfather, the train station down there, he was over that.
And you, sir, in the back?
This was a little bit of a tale, but one of my friends from South St. Louis, family built a home right where Sappington Barracks enters the Jefferson Barracks. There was a barrier fence there when they built the house. The war had ended, and they opened the swimming pool up to the public. We couldn't ride our bikes through there because they had a fence. So his father came out and just cut a big hole in the fence. Right up to the pool. He said he went all the way up to the west gate, which was up on Telegraph.
That's a good thing to
Well, and my next question, some of you already touched on this. How many of you have a relative or friend buried at Jefferson Barracks? Wow, quite a lot of us. So, like many of you, I too have a personal connection to Jefferson Barracks. I've gone to their museums and public events many times. My grandparents and one of my uncles are also buried there. And going into this project, that's pretty much all that Jefferson Barracks meant to me. I knew enough about its history to know why it was important, but it really wasn't much. Working with this collection expanded my understanding of what Jefferson Barracks means and what makes it sacred. I now feel a deeper connection with the site, so I can't see it now only as the place where some of my relatives are buried. Hopefully, my presentation today will make you feel the same way. What I'm going to do is tell you the story behind the Tony Fusco collection and give you a sense of what's in it and why preserving it matters. I'll try not to go into too much detail for two reasons. First, the collection's so huge that describing everything would take hours. Second, if I told you everything, then I wouldn't pique your curiosity. I want to inspire you to look through the collection yourselves and use it for research. My main idea here is this. The Tony Fusco collection not only tells the story of one Carondelet native's lifelong struggle to preserve Jefferson Barracks' heritage, but also shows us why the ghosts of Jefferson Barracks' past should matter to us today. Carondelet Historical Society's mission is to preserve and make accessible the Carondelet area's history. But what do this collection and my work managing it have to do with that mission? To understand this, you must know the story behind Jefferson Barracks, how the collection was created, and how it came here. For the first time after the Fusco collection languished untouched in our basement for 20 years, its care enables anyone to learn how part of Carondelet shaped America and how a man from Carondelet helped save this part. Let's go back to the year 1826. St. Louis was already an important part of westward expansion. We St. Louisans should all know why, because we're at the confluence of America's two longest rivers, the Missouri and Mississippi. Goods or people heading west would most easily get there by coming to St. Louis first. As this progressed, Native Americans were displaced from their lands, sparking conflicts throughout the 19th century that are known collectively as the Indian Wars. As a result, the military realized very quickly the need to have a military base in St. Louis. At first, they had Fort Bellefontaine on the banks of the Missouri River. Let me zoom in on this map here and show you where it is. Right here.
Oh, that's right.
The problem with Fort Bellefontaine was that it was in an area that flooded easily and was a breeding ground for disease. The military wanted a more stable place to establish a permanent military base. So Generals Henry Atkinson and Edmund Gaines were ordered to survey possible sites. They chose a plot of land in the commons of Vide Poche, which was French for empty pocket. This would later be known as the village of Carondelet. The site was on a high bluff by the banks of the Mississippi River, giving flood protection, It also offered easier access to transportation and plentiful building materials like wood and clay. And as Dave said, all of this the military bought from Carondelet for the whopping price of $5. This turned out to be a steal, as the base would play important roles in American military history and westward expansion. Cantonment Miller, as it was originally called, was the first permanent military base built west of the Mississippi River. In 1827, it was renamed Jefferson Barracks in honor of Thomas Jefferson, who had died the previous year. It would become the largest military base in the United States for a time. As the first infantry school of practice, Jefferson Barracks was a hub where troops received training and equipment before heading to frontier outposts out west. Jefferson Barracks, then, is really one of the things that made St. Louis the gateway to the West. In fact, many key Civil War leaders were stationed at Jefferson Barracks during their careers, including Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and more. Overall, units organized and/or stationed at Jefferson Barracks served in every major American conflict from the Black Hawk War to World War II. Several important innovations in American military training occurred at Jefferson Barracks. For instance, after the Black Hawk War in the 1830s made clear the need for a mobile force capable of traveling great distances quickly, the military organized the 1st American Cavalry Unit, the 1st Regiment of Dragoons, at Jefferson Barracks. This unit still survives today as the 1st Cavalry Regiment, except instead of horses they use tanks. Jefferson Barracks continued to be a center of training and recruitment into the 20th century, but its role would shift from infantry training to aviation training. In the 1920s, the first parachute drop from an airplane was made at Jefferson Barracks, proving the viability of a tactic that would see extensive use in World War II. During World War II, Jefferson Barracks was the largest Army Air Corps technical training base. Not all of Jefferson Barracks was used as a military base for this entire period. Due to the extremely high casualties during the Civil War, Congress passed a law in 1862 that authorized the creation of national cemeteries exclusively for military dead and their families. Part of Jefferson Barracks, which already had a post cemetery on its grounds, became Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in 1866. Later, the Department of Veterans Affairs, or VA, established a hospital there in the 1920s. However, in 1946, the military decided to declare Jefferson Barracks as surplus, meaning that they no longer needed it as a base. The VA continued to administer its hospital and the National Cemetery. Other parts were acquired by the St. Louis County government for use as a park, and the Missouri National Guard, however, would continue to use part of Jefferson Barracks as a base. This is just a summary of the site's history. The collection has folders talking about everything that I've just mentioned, so I will say more about some parts of it later on. Now, Jefferson Barracks isn't the collection's only subject. It's also about Tony Fusco himself. The collection includes his personal papers and records of his accomplishments, making it important for us to discuss his part in Carondelet's history. That's him on the right in that picture, by the way. Tony Fusco grew up in the Carondelet area. To answer the classic St. Louis question, he went to Cleveland High School. After graduating, he had a lengthy military career that spanned from 1945 to 1987. Altogether, he served in the United States Merchant Marines, the U.S. Army, the U.S. Coast Guard Reserve, and the Missouri Air National Guard. With the National Guard, he was stationed at Jefferson Barracks, and it was then that he discovered his love of the site's history. In 1960, out of curiosity, he wrote a letter to the National Archives asking for information on Jefferson Barracks history. They only sent him a small pamphlet in response. Dissatisfied with this, Fusco dedicated his life to researching, preserving, and increasing awareness of Jefferson Barracks' heritage. Not only would he lead his own efforts to preserve this history, but he was also involved in several organizations with similar goals. The entire Fusco collection is a record of his work. It includes documents about organizations, public programs, and ceremonies in which he was involved. It also contains everything he accumulated from his research and the articles and books that he wrote based on this research. Fusco once explained in an interview that he and his peers wanted to see the site become a living monument. He was appalled to see how many of the site's historic buildings the military and the National Guard had destroyed or neglected. Private developers threatened to destroy more of the site. "I would like to get people in this town stirred up," he said. "Few St. Louisans realize that just outside of our city limits stands the Army's first permanent base west of the Mississippi River, and that such men as Taylor, Grant, Lee, Davis, and Sherman served there." Unlike a monument that sits in a park unnoticed by most people going past it, a living monument draws people in by being an engaging community space. They are places people can go to learn about history or just have a fun day at the park. Rather than remain static, a living monument evolves over time and looks at historical context to bring history to life and make it meaningful. One organization Tony Fusco supported was Carondelet Historical Society. He's on the list of our charter members who joined when we were founded. In fact, that list is just in the back of this room. I believe he's the 26th person on that list. He even ran our newsletter for a while. His connection to this place may be why his family donated to us this collection and other objects that he kept after his death in 2002. Unfortunately, from there, the Fusco collection remained mostly untouched for almost 20 years. Someone did begin to organize it, but I don't know whether Fusco did this before he died, or someone here at the Society did it. Regardless, this wasn't enough. First, this person stopped less than halfway through. Second, we still had no idea what exactly was in the collection or where to find anything. Even our donation form only vaguely describes what Fusco's family donated. This is where I come in. I came here looking to gain collections management experience for my resume. Knowing my strong interest and background in military history, our president, John H. Remedius III, suggested that I work on the Fusco collection and come up with ideas for how we could use it, perhaps in an exhibit. As I began making an inventory that named and described each artifact, the full scope of my task became much clearer. Many documents and folders needed to be rearranged chronologically, alphabetically, or by subject matter. Plus, in the collection's untouched second half, items about the same subject were scattered across multiple boxes, so I brought them all together. As I did this, I uploaded this information to our collections database, PastPerfect. After over 2 years of work, this book is the result. It's 518 pages long. Across these 15 boxes, there are over 4,000 distinct objects, not counting the many duplicates Fusco has. I also tracked down and inventoried books, posters, and other items from his family. Currently, I'm cataloging and researching his large photograph collection. Making this accessible does a great deal for its care and preservation. Imagine that you're working at your job, and your boss tells you to find an important file by the end of the day. You know it's in your office. Unfortunately, your office looks like this. Yeah, good luck getting anything done in that mess. And in fact, imagine if a museum, library, or archive were as cluttered as this. History museums make history meaningful by teaching people how it shapes who they are and the world around them. Otherwise, why should anybody care about a bunch of old stuff? Museums can't teach anybody anything, however, without artifacts that they can actually find and use. If a museum can't use them, then people won't care about them. If people don't care about them, then they won't visit, or buy from the gift shop, or become members. 2 years ago, if someone came here wanting to know something specific about Jefferson Barracks, we couldn't tell them whether we had anything that could help them, apart from a few books in our library. Now, nobody has to spend ages looking through every box for something we might not even have. Now, they can just look it up. But what's actually in the collection? Because of the collection's size, I don't want to get too deep here. Most of it, though, can be boiled down into 3 categories. Tony Fusco's personal papers, the records and products of his research on Jefferson Barracks history, and documents about his and others' efforts to preserve Jefferson Barracks and make it a, as he put it, living monument. Not everything fits neatly into these categories, but most of the collection does. Everything that I've just told you about Fusco's life comes from his personal papers, so I'll only briefly explain what they are. They include documents about his upbringing, such as documents about his family and his baptismal and educational records, official records and artifacts from his military and National Guard service, and documents about his job as a riverboat operator working for the city of St. Louis. This job and his National Guard service allowed him to support his family while pursuing his research as a hobby. Since his unit was stationed at Jefferson Barracks, Fusco's records on the Missouri National Guard are as much a part of the Jefferson Barracks story as anything else in the collection. Not only do they show what he did, but they also give you a sense of what life in the Guard was like. For example, the picture in this slide here from Fusco's photo collection illustrates one of his duties and part of the National Guard's function. It shows National Guard troops at Jefferson Barracks boarding a 2.5-ton truck. The National Guard is the reserve force for the U.S. Army and Air Force. If there's an emergency and the military needs more people immediately, then the federal government can mobilize National Guard units at a moment's notice. For that to work, though, National Guard personnel must keep up with the military standards by completing a certain amount of training every year. One option was to participate in an annual training assembly, in which Guard units from different states gathered at an actual U.S. military base for a big training exercise. Tony Fusco once participated in a simulated attack during an annual training assembly at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, for example. Frequently, his job was to transport people or equipment from Jefferson Barracks to training sites in a truck just like this one. Among the collection's records are documents that Fusco received about these assemblies, like official orders explaining which units and people would participate, bulletins explaining the assembly's objectives, and hand-drawn maps of his route to the training site. As he advanced within the Guard, Fusco took on greater responsibilities in public relations and as an historian specialist. The collection says more about his duties in these roles, too. The second category, research products, is a central pillar of both the collection's value and Fusco's fight for Jefferson Barracks heritage. It consists of photocopies of primary and secondary sources that he compiled and documents that he produced from this research, like notes, articles, and correspondence between himself and various archives. Recall that the purpose of this presentation is to show you why the Fusco collection is useful and worth preserving. So here, I'll ask you to consider one question. How does this collection help someone who's researching Jefferson Barracks history? Anyone trying to learn about Jefferson Barracks history will likely encounter 3 obstacles that make it difficult to gain real insight. Fusco encountered them too and tried to respond to them. Not only do these obstacles help us understand how, what, and why Tony Fusco researched, but I'm also going to use them as criteria for evaluating how well this collection helps researchers today. Overall, the collection won't satisfy everybody, but it still gives researchers of today a unique gift. Its files contain long-forgotten personal stories that have never been together in one place before. The first obstacle is the difficulty in obtaining primary and secondary source materials. As I said earlier, Tony Fusco began his research after a request for information from the National Archives yielded only a small pamphlet. In truth, the National Archives had loads of materials about Jefferson Barracks, but the pamphlet was all they could give him. Archives and libraries typically only have the staff and time to search for very specific things. Materials on Jefferson Barracks history isn't specific enough. It's a broad topic spanning almost 200 years. Moreover, if you're going to dig deep into Jefferson Barracks history, you must think and look beyond St. Louis. Its full story touches every corner of this country and every chapter of U.S. military history after 1826. People from all over the United States were stationed there, and they often moved from there to frontier outposts. Many fought in other countries, or in battles with Native Americans that occurred across the Old West. Not only that, but there are people from places other than St. Louis buried at the National Cemetery. Likewise, potentially relevant materials about these things are also scattered across the United States. Fusco responded to this obstacle by changing how he interacted with archives. Rather than continue asking for something as broad as materials on Jefferson Barracks history, he narrowed his search to specific aspects of its history. He researched particular events in the site's history, its contributions to specific conflicts, the history of specific units that were organized or stationed there, and particular people who were stationed or buried there. As much as possible, he also tried to research the origins of Jefferson Barracks, its continued connections to the Carondelet area after its founding, life at the site, and much more. Because the National Archives sometimes didn't have or couldn't provide what he was looking for, Fusco turned to many other archives, libraries, and historical societies across the country. The other institutions he contacted include, but aren't limited to, the U.S. Army Military History Institute in Pennsylvania, the University of Missouri, the Logan County Genealogical Society, the Colorado State Historical Society, the Army Center of Military History, the State Historical Society of Missouri, the Ohio Historical Society, the Kansas State Historical Society, the Montana Historical Society, the Missouri Historical Society, and the Library of Congress. As an example of what his research was like, let's look at only box 7 in the collection, which is about Fusco's research on the Civil War. Just looking at it makes it clear why I'm cautious about going into too much detail about the collection's contents. Fusco's research covered a vast range of topics and led him to accumulate many kinds of documents. Some documents, but not all, relate closely to the history of Jefferson Barracks. For instance, there are photocopies of newspaper clippings about conditions at military hospitals in Missouri, including the one which was at Jefferson Barracks. This picture from the collection, for example, is a lithographic print of what Jefferson Barracks looked like in 1864. Going up the Mississippi River, you can see a steamship that says U.S. Hospital. It's likely carrying wounded soldiers from battles deep in Confederate territory. In the collection, there are also photocopies of primary and secondary sources about prisoner of war camps in St. Louis, showing the context behind the many burials of Confederate prisoners of war at the National Cemetery. There's also an excerpt from a book about Union soldiers from Minnesota, of whom so many were buried at Jefferson Barracks that there's a monument to them. Some documents don't relate specifically to Jefferson Barracks, but are about Civil War history in St. Louis and in Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, and Arkansas in general. There are photocopies of clippings from Missouri newspapers that date from the Civil War about battles and encounters between civilians and soldiers on both sides. There are photocopies of records of courts-martial that were held in St. Louis during the war. There are photocopied excerpts from secondary sources about units organized in this area, including some all-black units. There are even documents that have nothing to do with this general area, like a print of a painting that depicts the Battle of Lookout Mountain, Tennessee, and pamphlets made for visitors at the Fort Monroe Casemate Museum in Virginia. And there's plenty of other stuff that I'm leaving out. Multiply this by 15, and you'll get why I'm not doing this for the entire collection. For those who are curious, though, the collection also contains materials about Jefferson Barracks' contributions to the Indian Wars, Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. While this may seem scatterbrained, if you consider Box 7's contents together, then you can begin to see why Jefferson Barracks matters so much to American history. Tony Fusco rightly believed that looking beyond Jefferson Barracks boundaries and understanding what else was going on in our region is crucial to understanding the barracks' historical and strategic significance. During and after the Civil War, Jefferson Barracks was the headquarters of the Department of the Missouri. That means the commanders there oversaw all military operations in Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas, Illinois, part of Kentucky, and Indian Territory. So ask yourself, why was it important to maintain such a military presence here during the Civil War? Missouri was a slave state that begrudgingly stayed in the Union. Here occurred several critical events that led to the Civil War's outbreak, like the beginnings of the Dred Scott case and the Kansas-Missouri border war known as Bleeding Kansas. Missouri was such a hot spot that the violence spilled over into nearby states. This also made Missouri the site of the third highest number of Civil War battles and skirmishes, behind only Virginia and Tennessee. Control of Missouri would decide the course of the war. At stake were the largest military base west of the Mississippi in Jefferson Barracks, the largest supply of weapons and ammunition west of the Mississippi in the St. Louis Arsenal, and the confluence of America's two longest rivers. The value of the breadth of Tony Fusco's research becomes even clearer when you consider the second obstacle that anyone researching Jefferson Barracks will encounter. No one has ever written a definitive, academic, professionally published book about it. Imagine how much easier learning about Jefferson Barracks history would be if such a book existed. Instead of bugging the National Archives, Fusco could have just visited a public library. It's difficult to bring together the history of Jefferson Barracks in a comprehensive, authoritative book if you must go all over the country to get the sources you need. By gathering so many sources from so many different archives and libraries into one collection then, Tony Fusco did much of the legwork for us. To this day, though, only a few self-published books by amateur historians and small printed media like articles, booklets, pamphlets, and the like that only cover bits and pieces exist. Not all books written by amateur historians are bad. Some are excellent. As a trained historian, however, I've learned to take them with a bit of a grain of salt. Books and articles written by academics are subject to a rigorous peer review process. Lacking this, and a scholar's years of training, the works of amateur historians sometimes have errors in interpretation or the usage of sources that scholars would know to avoid. Sometimes these errors are small, but sometimes they're big. Not only would a scholarly book be more reliable then, but it would also reach more people. Self-published books are harder to find than professionally published ones, because their authors usually only print a few copies. If you, like Tony Fusco, want to call attention to the story of Jefferson Barracks, then you must tell it in a form that many people can access. Tony Fusco was not an academic historian, but as I said, he was an historian specialist in the Missouri National Guard. He also never wrote a comprehensive, professionally published book on Jefferson Barracks history. He did, however, share stories from its history with a wide audience by turning some of his research into 2 booklets and countless articles for local newspapers and newsletters. Copies of these are included in the collection, and I've shown photocopies of some of them on this slide. Increasing awareness of Jefferson Barracks' heritage, he hoped, would cause more people to care about preserving it. It's like why zoos teach people about animals. The more you know and understand about other animals, the less you fear them, and the more you care about keeping them from going extinct. You'll probably care more about stingrays after petting one at the St. Louis Zoo, for example. Small forms of printed media can be quite useful, but they often give researchers a third obstacle by presenting information in what I call the trivia approach. The trivia approach presents interesting tidbits instead of providing truly meaningful, rich historical detail. Most pamphlets, interpretive panels, booklets, and the like about Jefferson Barracks history that I've seen often cover the same details. Unless you dig deeper, this is all that you can find. For instance, one tidbit that's often emphasized is the fact that prominent historical figures like Grant, Jefferson Davis, Sherman, Lee, and others were stationed at Jefferson Barracks. That's not new to me at all. I've read that again and again and again at Soldiers Memorial, at the Missouri Civil War Museum, on interpretive panels at Jefferson Barracks, in Fusco's articles, and in books. You know what it's like when you hear a song like It's a Small World over and over again? It's annoying, isn't it? That's how I feel when I come across the same old tidbits about Jefferson Barracks for the billionth time. While it's interesting that many top Civil War leaders served at Jefferson Barracks, part of me wonders, so what? What did they do there? What was their training like? What were their instructors like? What was daily life like? That's what I want to know. But you won't find that level of detail unless you dig deeper. Numerous studies on how people learn and retain information back me up on this point. Interesting trivia tidbits and raw data are easily forgotten, unless they're hammered into you repeatedly like I've just described. We remember information if it relates to our experiences and interests in a meaningful way. This also makes learning more fun. For example, I once interviewed staff at the Greater St. Louis Air and Space Museum for one of my museum studies classes. They told me about a family that came by for a tour. The daughter in this family did not want to be there. She was bored, paid no attention, and mostly looked at her phone. When the tour guide mentioned that they had an aircraft that once belonged to Howard Hughes, though, she perked up and said, "Really? Can we see it?" "Sure," the tour guide said. "We can even take you inside it." That made her jump up and down and say, "Oh, please, Mom and Dad, can we please do that, please?" It turned out that she had a huge crush on Leonardo DiCaprio, who once played Howard Hughes in the movie The Aviator. Raw facts aren't enough. You must go deeper and connect with people. Does Fusco go deeper? I'll leave that up to you to decide. In my opinion, though, I think his writing is dry and dull at times, and he didn't go very far beyond the information that's commonly covered through the trivia approach. Where he truly made Jefferson Barracks history is engaging is in his research. Browsing the Fusco collection yourself will teach you more than reading everything that he wrote will. There are things that he researched but never wrote about. Using Fusco's sources also gives you the freedom to find your own connections and take your learning in the direction of your choice, making for a more personalized experience. In my opinion, the most powerful part of the Fusco collection is his research related to people buried and or stationed at Jefferson Barracks. Some of the people he researched were both stationed and later buried there, while others were either only stationed or only buried there. Other files talk about not an individual grave, but the context behind a category of burials, like the files about camps for Confederate prisoners of war and about the monument to Union soldiers from Minnesota that I mentioned earlier. Recall what I said at the beginning of this presentation. Working on this collection gave me a greater appreciation of Jefferson Barracks' heritage and why it matters. This part of the collection is one of the biggest reasons why this happened. Learning about people buried or stationed at Jefferson Barracks helps us better honor these heroes' service and the deep well of American heritage that their stories represent. I'm going to ask you all some questions to get you thinking again. Tributes to military values and military service are everywhere in American culture. Every Memorial Day and Veterans Day, sporting events, on bumper stickers, and loads of other places, we are told to remember the men and women who have served or are serving our country. Never forget. But do we really remember? Have any of you ever visited a monument that shows an engraved list of names of people who died, like the Vietnam Wall in DC, the 9/11 monument in New York City, or even the Cenotaph at Soldiers Memorial? Please raise your hand if you have. Quite a lot of us. Someone, pick which ones you've seen. You, ma'am?
Me?
Yeah.
What, things I've seen?
Yeah, the like walls of people.
Oh, well, the Vietnam Wall, and of course down the Soldiers Memorial. Yeah.
And anyone else? So, did any of you remember a specific name from those monuments?
Classmate.
Classmate? You, sir?
Classmate.
So that's actually my point here. You remember these names because it's meaningful to you, because it's someone you knew. Were there any other names you memorized, remembered? Is that the only one? And so, yeah, I think so. Because ordinarily, the names on these lists leave no impact on us. Those who do know or remember a name can do so because it's more than just a name to them. It's a person. They know something about what that person did, where they served, what their life was like, or how they died. To truly remember those who served, we must also be able to see the people behind the names. Learning about them through research helps us do that. Fusco's research uncovered many stories of courage that remind us of the tragic cost of war and how much our men and women in uniform have sacrificed for our country. In particular, the stories of the Medal of Honor recipients buried at Jefferson Barracks and the cemetery's group burials have this effect. For these, Fusco obtained copies of government records that explore the military service of the deceased and how they died. Photocopies of secondary sources in some files also explore the larger context behind the battles in which they fought. In many cases, Fusco found few surviving personal details about these individuals. By relating these details to a larger context, though, he helps us better understand not only the bigger picture of American history, but also the smaller picture of these people's lives. Let's look at one example that's both a Medal of Honor burial and a group burial. The grave of B-24 bomber pilot, First Lieutenant Donald Puckett. That's him on the left, and his grave on the right. Donald Puckett received the Medal of Honor posthumously and was buried together with 5 other men in his bomber crew. They died in July 1944 while on a mission to bomb enemy oil fields in Ploiești, Romania. After they had dropped their bombs, their B-24 took heavy damage from anti-aircraft fire. Puckett transferred control of the plane to his co-pilot so that he could assess the damage. Out of their 12-man crew, 1 was dead and 6 were wounded. They were still flying, but rapidly losing altitude. They wouldn't have enough time to make it back to friendly territory. So Puckett ordered everyone to parachute out of the plane. Half of his crew made it out, but 3 men were too wounded and paralyzed with shock to leave. Rather than save himself, Puckett refused to abandon them, and he was last seen trying to regain control of the plane and maneuver it to a safe landing. Despite his best efforts, they crashed into a mountainside. Because most of us usually only visit a small part of Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery for funerals or to visit a family member's grave, most probably don't realize that it even has group burials. In fact, it has more than 560. By World War II, because of a new policy the military adopted, Jefferson Barracks became the central repository for group burials resulting from national disasters. Some of Fusco's documents about Puckett's burial explain why. What happened with group burials was that, especially before DNA testing came around, you couldn't always identify the names individually, only collectively. Well, what does that mean? Well, often when an airplane crashes, the remains of the people on board are so badly damaged that you can't say that these remains belong to this person and those remains belong to that person. However, with military planes, there's plenty of evidence that can tell you who was assigned to it when it crashed. There are duty rosters. Each plane has a registration number. Every part in a plane has its own number. All of these can be found by studying the wreckage and the military's copious records. That made things easier in Puckett's case that there were survivors. These things made it possible to know with certainty who these 6 people buried here are, but they couldn't attach one name to each set of remains. Now, the military's policy was that they would bury these remains together in a cemetery that's close to the geographic center of where all of the deceased service members' families lived. That way, the distance and cost of traveling to visit the grave would be about the same for each family. Because Missouri is right in the middle of the country, Jefferson Barracks is where a lot of these group burials ended up. Fusco's records and my own research also shed light on a bigger story and the context around the deaths of Puckett and his crew. Puckett's Medal of Honor citation says that he died in a highly effective attack against vital oil installations in Ploiești, Romania. Both the final reports on his mission and historians who've studied the Romanian bombing campaign would disagree with calling it highly effective. The official report on Puckett's mission states, and I quote, "Results were generally unobserved due to a very effective smokescreen and to column of black smoke rising to 18,000 feet. Some bombs believed to have fallen short and to right of aiming point, others probably over." This problem was actually typical of many Allied bombing campaigns, especially the Romanian campaign. Despite repeated attempts to bomb Romanian oil fields from June 1942 to August 1944, the Allies failed to make any impact on oil production and suffered greater losses than the enemy. Most bombs either missed their target or only caused damage that was easily repaired. So the entire campaign was considered at the time to be a strategic failure. This is one of many reasons why scholars continue to debate the strategic value of Allied bombing in World War II. It was a flawed and costly tactic. I say this not to dishonor the men who flew these missions. Indeed, the largest operation in the Romanian campaign, Operation Tidal Wave in August 1943, produced 5 Medal of Honor recipients, more than any other single operation in the war. These men should be honored, as should Donald Puckett. However, honoring heroes like Puckett is one thing. Glorifying war while ignoring its horrors and devastating cost is another. The brutal, terrifying reality of World War II was why 3 members of Puckett's crew were too paralyzed with fear to move. It also makes it amazing that Puckett kept a level head and put others before himself. This is just one of the remarkable personal stories that Fusco uncovered. I wish I had time to discuss others in more detail. Some are tragic stories that help us further appreciate how sacred Jefferson Barracks is. In my opinion, the most compelling example of this is the cemetery's largest group burial, which I show on this slide. It contains the remains of 123 American servicemen who died in a massacre at the Japanese prisoner of war camp in Palawan, a part of the Philippines. Others mainly teach us forgotten stories of history, like the story of Frank Woodward. He wasn't buried at Jefferson Barracks, but his story reveals what life was like while he was stationed there. Woodward was a Post-Dispatch reporter who enlisted under false pretenses to investigate rising desertions at Jefferson Barracks. After he exposed harsh living conditions and disciplinary practices there, the military briefly arrested him. In response to public backlash, though, the military soon released him and made major reforms. Other files reveal few personal details, like those about Medal of Honor recipients Private David Ryan and Sergeant Alonzo Stokes. Their medal citations say little more than gallantry in action during the Indian Wars. Yet their files are some of the collection's biggest. They contain many primary and secondary sources about the battles in which they fought, allowing you to explore this complicated part of U.S. history. By contrast, the small size of Fusco's file on Brigadier General Stephen Groesbeck, who was buried at Jefferson Barracks, belies his life's rich historical context. Groesbeck served in an Iowa cavalry regiment during the Civil War, was the Adjutant General of the Freedmen's Bureau, the main government agency that implemented Reconstruction in the post-Civil War South, worked in the Judge Advocate General, and fought in the Spanish-American War. Surely Fusco only scratched the surface of his story. And there are many others, all of which shed light on either Jefferson Barracks history or American history in general, the good parts and the bad. As some of my examples suggest, the collection doesn't answer every question about Jefferson Barracks history, but it still provides an excellent starting point. Some things Fusco just didn't research. His files on World War II, for example, cover events that occurred before the US entered the war and after it ended, but they have nothing about stuff that occurred during America's involvement. With many other subjects, archives had materials, but they had too much to sift through and photocopy them. This can leave you frustrated. Fortunately, his records, request forms, and letters to and from archives are in the collection. These archives probably still have the records that Fusco couldn't get. They may have even been digitized by now. So, if the collection doesn't have good documents about something, it might tell you where else you can look. Before I worked on this collection, I would try to visit my grandparents' grave whenever I went to Jefferson Barracks for any reason. Now, thanks to Tony Fusco, there are other graves that I also visit. I now feel an emotional connection to more than one story. In one of his articles about the history of Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery, Fusco explained how he saw the cemetery and the stories it contains. As you walk along the peaceful and silent paths, he wrote, one can read with infinite clarity the history of America chiseled upon stone, standing as pages from a history book. To him, each grave was a monument not just to a person, but also to the parts of American history that he or she touched. Even if, as often happens in research, he found so few details about a person that their file only contains one or two documents, the broader context around their lives still tells us a lot about American history. Fusco's research helped him tell these stories, and today allows us to explore them ourselves. In summary, the Fusco collection does a great deal to advance our appreciation of Jefferson Barracks history. This subject is very challenging to research. It's so vast that relevant materials are scattered in archives across the United States. Getting any materials can be difficult unless you're looking for something specific. Consequently, Jefferson Barracks' rich history has only been told by small, superficial forms of media, rather than a comprehensive scholarly book. Even the Fusco collection itself has some frustrating gaps and superficial contents. Nonetheless, it gets us closer to a complete, meaningful appreciation of Jefferson Barracks' importance, both in military history and as a shrine to American heritage, warts and all. Copies of sources from all over the country, sources that not even the St. Louis County staff at Jefferson Barracks have in their archives, are now together in one place, in the community from which Jefferson Barracks was born. My third and final category of the collection concerns Fusco's records about his and others' efforts to preserve Jefferson Barracks' heritage and turn it into a living monument. I would say that it is indeed a living monument for us today, but how did this happen? How did a military base that mainly only service members could access become a community space that's important to both veterans and non-veterans? Fusco's records on how he and others helped Jefferson Barracks become a living monument show it wouldn't be what it is today without a community of activists that strove to protect and promote its heritage, a lesson and a warning which we must heed today. Close this. As I mentioned earlier, in 1946, the military declared Jefferson Barracks military base as surplus. It shut down the base and gave away all the land that it managed. If things had been left to their own devices, Jefferson Barracks would have been lost after this. Parts of its heritage and historical integrity were damaged immediately after it was declared surplus. Historic buildings were demolished, left neglected, or altered by the National Guard. The building in this picture, for example, caught fire due to neglect. Parts of the original military base that were used for training and residences were abandoned and destroyed to make room for expansions to the National Cemetery. Businesses bought up other parts of the site for commercial or residential use. They wanted more, too. The St. Louis County government established a park on the site, promised to preserve its heritage, and even established a museum. Despite these promises, it rezoned parts of the site so private businesses could acquire them. Fusco and others believed the government and these museums should be doing much more to preserve and interpret history. Veterans organizations were the first and most consistent part of the community to intervene because they already had a long-standing emotional stake in Jefferson Barracks. In addition to the Minnesota state government, veterans organizations helped sponsor the cemetery's monument to Union soldiers from Minnesota in the 1920s. Groups like the Grand Army of the Republic, American Legion, United Spanish War Veterans, and others held Memorial Day ceremonies at that monument going back at least to 1931, according to articles I found in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. After the base was declared surplus, veterans groups stepped up dramatically to ensure Jefferson Barracks would be active and cared for. Early in the 1950s, representatives from several different groups in St. Louis formed the Inter-Veterans Memorial Day Service Committee and the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery Assistance Committee. Tony Fusco was a member of both committees. Drawing on his experience doing similar work in the Missouri National Guard, he was in charge of public relations and special projects in both groups. These two committees organized annual ceremonies on Jefferson Barracks grounds. As their name states, the Inter-Veterans Memorial Day Service Committee focused on Memorial Day ceremonies. With their efforts, local and federal officials, religious leaders, local schools, and military units like the Scott Air Force Base Band participated in these ceremonies each year. The Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery Assistance Committee, on the other hand, organized Easter Sunday services, but they also worked with public officials. They were specifically founded to ensure that Congress appropriated proper funds for the cemetery's care and to assist the cemetery's superintendent and staff. Fusco's records on these organizations include programs for their ceremonies, correspondence between Fusco and officials he worked with, and newspaper clippings about their activities. Veterans groups also added to Jefferson Barracks in more permanent ways, making it a dynamic, growing space. This slide shows monuments and structures on the barracks grounds that were sponsored, dedicated, or built by an organization that's represented in the collection. All of them were built after Jefferson Barracks was declared surplus and involved organizations that regularly held meetings or group activities at the site. They include the Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge Monument, which is right here. It was sponsored by the Veterans Group for the St. Louis chapter for veterans of that battle, and a monument to the veterans of the Merchant Marines and Navy Armed Guards, right here. And the cemetery's chapel in the bottom right corner, and its Veterans Memorial Amphitheater, just to name a few. That's the one on the top right. The amphitheater, in fact, was actually built by the National Cemetery Assistance Committee. Fusco kept files on all of these organizations, sometimes because he was a part of them, but other times because he wanted to preserve a record of their activities and the stories behind how these structures came about. Not only are the chapel and amphitheater still used for programs and events today, but also more monuments have been added to Jefferson Barracks since Tony Fusco's death. This shows that Jefferson Barracks has been anything but static. It is brimming with life as the community has added to it over the years. Veterans' efforts to make Jefferson Barracks a community space might have been less successful if only veterans had been involved. Tony Fusco's own work made the cause relevant to non-veterans. We've already seen how he engaged people through his articles on Jefferson Barracks history and his public relations skills. An example of how he used both is in his leadership of the Jefferson Barracks National Landmark Committee. The committee's goal was to secure National Historic Landmark status for Jefferson Barracks. This would protect it from private development and allow it to receive public funds and tax breaks for its preservation. However, the National Park Service had already considered and rejected Jefferson Barracks for landmark status twice, because its historical integrity had been damaged by modern alterations and by the destruction of historic buildings. Fusco hoped a public awareness campaign would generate enough political pressure to change the Park Service's mind. As the committee's president, Fusco recruited the editor of the South St. Louis County News, a local newspaper, to the committee as a board member. Between 1969 and 1972, this paper published Fusco's articles about Jefferson Barracks history and regularly reported on the committee's progress and threats to the site's preservation. All of these articles are included in the collection. The committee also began a massive letter-writing campaign. The goal of this was to secure public endorsements of making Jefferson Barracks a national landmark from local businesses, political leaders, veterans organizations, and community groups. Every endorsement was then reported in the press and mailed to federal officials. Importantly, this campaign secured the support of U.S. Representative Leonore K. Sullivan of Missouri, who became a key advocate for the committee's efforts. You might have heard that name because she was a key part of establishing the arch. Although the Park Service would reject Jefferson Barracks for a third time, the committee did have some successes. First, they successfully applied to have Jefferson Barracks placed on the National Register of Historic Places. This doesn't provide as much protection as National Historic Landmark status, but it's better than nothing. Second, they attracted tremendous public attention and support to Jefferson Barracks preservation. This caused the county government to reject 2 proposals to rezone part of Jefferson Barracks for apartments. Earlier proposals had gotten through with next to no opposition. Increased public concern also inspired efforts to beautify and clean up the cemetery's grounds. The picture you see here is of the cemetery's entrance in late 1969. You can see there's trash everywhere, including an abandoned car. The day after the South St. Louis County News and other local newspapers called out the mess, local Boy Scout troops organized to clean up. You don't see such trash just being left at the gates of Jefferson Barracks anymore. Activists like Tony Fusco are the reason why. In conclusion, I want to leave you thinking about the state of Jefferson Barracks today and what it means for its future. Thanks to Tony Fusco and others, Jefferson Barracks continues to thrive as a living monument and community space for both veterans and non-veterans. It is undoubtedly cared for better than it was right after it was declared surplus. Living history programs, concerts, ceremonies, and other events continued to be held there with the help of the St. Louis County Parks Department. If Tony Fusco were alive today, then I think he'd be happy to see how Jefferson Barracks has continued to evolve since his death. As I said, new memorials have been added to the cemetery's grounds, including this one in the center here, is to service members from St. Louis who died in World War I. It was dedicated in 2012, but it features plaques from the Gold Star Court of Honor that once lined Kings Highway Boulevard. In 2013, preservationists scored a major victory with the establishment of the Missouri Civil War Museum. It's housed in the barracks' old Post Exchange building, which had sat neglected for decades. Maps give us another way to see how the site has changed, how it has been neglected, and how it's been cared for over time. This is a 1943 map of Jefferson Barracks from the Truman Presidential Library. It shows us both the base's layout and how the government was planning to divide it up after declaring it surplus. There's this area in the center here is to be applied for by the state under PL 829, according to the legend. I guess this has something to do with the Missouri National Guard base, since that's what's there now. And this area in the north, here, has been been proposed for industrial use, and it still is today. And beneath there is a yellow area that's to be applied for by the county, presumably for park use. Notice on the right side of the map, there's an area marked with blue dots, especially in this, can you see this corner right here? That area, according to the legend, is under the Veterans Administration's control. Remember that. This Google Maps screenshot shows the same area today. Jefferson Barracks' original boundaries are this red line here that I've drawn, and Interstate 255 on the side there. Several things, both good and bad, have changed. For one, Jefferson Barracks County Park has more than doubled in size. The 43 map had the county planning to purchase land up to this road here. It now extends to this road. Fusco and his colleagues from the Jefferson Barracks Landmark Committee had a little bit to do with that. They helped secure voters' approval of bond issues that funded expansions to county parks. These saved parts of Jefferson Barracks from being rezoned by private developers. Importantly, it also shows how the National Cemetery grew over time. The VA acquired parts of Jefferson Barracks that were originally used by the military. Some original structures shown on the 1943 map were destroyed in the process, but at least veterans are still being honored. In 2015, however, the VA announced that they would run out of burial space between 2021 and 2028, unless the county government allowed them to purchase part of Sylvan Springs Park, which is right here. According to local news stories, this sparked a heated debate, but the sale still went through in 2018. With this, the VA estimates that it will have space until about 2038. A decision the VA made in the past helped create this problem, though. Remember that corner of land that I told you about? It's now this Walmart. Now, as much as I enjoy criticizing Walmart, the VA actually sold the land to a different company. This picture from the collection shows a recreation of the first parachute drop from an airplane, which, as I've said, occurred at Jefferson Barracks. This was part of a celebration of Jefferson Barracks' sesquicentennial that Fusco and the National Guard organized in 1976. Where Walmart is today, we can see a Central Hardware store. Right there. It's kind of faint, but you can see Central Hardware if you look closely. So what that means is the VA must have sold this land sometime before 1976. Regardless of who they sold it to, This demonstrates that unless we pay attention to how historic sites are used and cared for, short-sighted decisions made without regard for history can have far-reaching repercussions. When Jefferson Barracks does run out of burial space, this shouldn't automatically mean the end of its life. It should be just another stage of its evolution as a truly living monument. But we must continue preserving and sharing its heritage through collections like this one. From President Ulysses S. Grant to First Lieutenant Donald Puckett to Private David Ryan, the people stationed or buried at Jefferson Barracks have shaped this country through struggle and sacrifice. Each one has a story that tells us what makes Jefferson Barracks a sacred place that we must continue to care for. As Jefferson Barracks was threatened by neglect and private developers, Tony Fusco gathered hundreds of stories and thousands of documents as one of many things he did to show others why they ought to care about this historic site. Under the Carondelet Historical Society's care, his collection still has this power. But I have only shared a portion of its contents with you today. Look through it and discover for yourself how the secrets of Jefferson Barracks speak to you. Anybody have any questions that I can answer about the collection?
I'm confused about the Central Hardware. Now the picture you showed of Central Hardware is the one that's at Forder and Lemay, right?
No, that's at Telegraph and 255. It's no longer a Central Hardware now. If you look at the picture, you can tell the difference. I mean, this is now oriented toward the west, the entrances, whereas now the Walmart's entrance is oriented a different direction. Or actually, actually, the Central Harbor was oriented to the north, whereas this was oriented to the west. According to my dad, a possible reason why it was changed was because that particular section of highway was rather unsafe. And so there was the clover leaf that you see there was actually redesigned, and it has fewer loops now. But as a result of that, the highway now cut into the space. So there was now less space for a store, so the Walmart had to put it in a different orientation. You in the back.
I assume most people know there's a church on Telegraph Road. I think it's called, I'm not too familiar with the neighborhood, I think it's called St. Mark's Methodist Church. That used to be a church on the post.
St. Bernadette.
It's a frame building.
St. Bernadette.
St. Bernadette.
No, that's two different things.
St. Bernadette is the old main theater. I live right next to it.
That's true, but that's not the building they're talking about.
Oh, okay.
It's
It's
a
a frame
telegraph. It was moved off of the property.
Oh, St. Martin's?
Yeah.
It's on the west side of the Telegraph.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm actually not too familiar with that because the collection actually, that's one of the subjects that the collection doesn't really touch on much.
Oh, I wanted to say that it's true that the city, the county signed an agreement to sell half of Sylvan Springs Park, but the sale has never gone through because the land, the price has never been appropriated by Congress.
Ah.
So it's possible that it'll never be appropriated if we keep pressuring our local congressman to object every time that's put on in the budget.
So it's like they still haven't really gained more land then.
Right.
I mean, because I've noticed one difference thing in my more recent visits to Jefferson Barracks. They've added kind of a place for cremated remains.
Yes.
So they're starting to rely more on cremations to save space.
Right.
There's a lot more.
Yeah, there's a lot of those.
Any other questions? You, sir?
What was the guiding thing that made Jefferson Barracks fall out of grace? So that by the end of World War II, it wasn't needed anymore?
Too small.
As they said, too small. And another thing, it was so big, and it was ideally, it was that big, and at the time when its location gave it such a big advantage was when the Indian Wars were still going on. And so once the frontier had got more settled and conflicts with Indians happened less often, its use and importance really changed. Plus, I guess another big shift would have been, a lot of its duties would have shifted over to places like Scott Air Force Base.
So currently, how many associations or volunteer groups or whatever are involved in lobbying for and preservation? How many groups is?
I don't know an exact number. I know there are still lots of veterans organizations still active on the site, but as far as a specific number, I don't know. And is that all the time we have? Or? Okay, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Andrews. Very interesting talk today. We do have refreshments in the back, so stop and get something. And we're open throughout the building. Will be open at least another hour or so.